Hello everyone, I'm Craig Boswell. Today on Interview 360, a true inside look at diplomacy. Ambassador Chaz Freeman is here. He served as chief interpreter for President Nixon during the 1972 trip to China, the historic visit that led to the establishment of diplomatic relations. Ambassador Freeman has the behind-the-scenes knowledge of the first contact between the two nations. He also returned to Beijing to serve as Deputy Chief of Mission at the newly established U.S. Embassy. So we have a lot to talk about, and Ambassador Freeman, it is good to see you.
Nice to see you, Craig.
Let's kind of set the scene. February 1972, it's cold in Beijing. You're on the ground on this historic trip. What is your initial impression? What is it like?
Well, I didn't know that I was going to begin with. I spent about a month and a half, 2 months before that trip, locked up in the State Department Operations Center, writing papers for the president, briefing papers so that he would know what the Chinese position was on all sorts of matters and know what to say in response to it. I actually found out that I was going when someone pushed some baggage tags through the mail slot at my front door. And someone else called me and said,
Surprise.
Time Magazine says you're going on this trip as the main interpreter, and nobody told me.
Wow. And one of the things that surprised me, there's not an electronic infrastructure to broadcast this type of a visit. What did you see and what did they have to arrange?
Well, we had to fly in a TV ground station, satellite ground station.
From scratch,
to connect,
right?
Yeah, everything from scratch to connect. We had to rewire hotels. We had to do a lot of things. Everywhere the White House, the president travels, usually they redo the phone system. So you pick up the phone, and you got the White House operator on the other end.
Wow. And do you recall your first encounter with a Chinese official?
Yeah, he's actually become a good friend of mine. But young man who had not met an American before met me in Shanghai, and we exchanged some words. And very personable fellow, and quite successful as a diplomat later on.
Anyone that we know, or anyone that you care?
No, I don't want to give out his name. He's entitled to his anonymity in old age.
And I'm always curious about interpreting, translating, because cultural references can be misinterpreted, and likely you probably ran into situations like that.
Serious issues. We actually had to interrupt the discussions at one point over an issue, which was how to translate deterrence. I used a term that was in use in Taiwan, 吓阻, which means to intimidate and block. The term that the mainland preferred was 威慑, which means to frighten and intimidate. I asked them, would you use this word to describe your own policy? No. And there's it's taken a long time. The Chinese have finally come up with a neutral term, 设置, which means to intimidate and halt the other side, which is a very good translation of deterrence. There were other instances. On one occasion, we had an argument over how to translate parallel, as in parallel policies. One rendition was 并行不悖, which means two lines that project and never meet. My preferred translation, which the Chinese liked, was 异途同归, to get to the same result by different roads.
Right.
Which is, I think, more like what was meant.
Yeah, right, more appropriate and more descriptive. These conversations would come up, I would assume you were involved in the drafting and maybe the language in the Shanghai communique as well.
I reviewed it. I had drafted some of it in English before, so I knew what was in there, but the translation was done by the Chinese side. They were scrupulously fair. There were instances where they could have shaded nuances a bit in their own direction. They did not. So I was impressed by their professionalism and basic honesty, which I assume is what they wanted me to be impressed by.
Right. And you were talking about deterrence. Were you referencing like nuclear deterrence or just deterrence and just aggression in general or economic
I think the context
deterrence?
was probably nuclear.
Right.
But deterrence in general, it's an interesting, very important concept. It basically is the use of the military to keep the peace. And it makes a difference whether it's portrayed as aggressive or preventative.
Speaking of interpreting and you learning the language so quickly, I believe I read that of your reluctance to interpret something on the fly, it was at a banquet that I think you were called to President Nixon's, where he was in China at the time, and you were asked to interpret a toast, I think, on the fly.
Well, it was a little different, actually. I was finally, on the day we arrived in Beijing, the president invited me over to meet him. I had not met him. And later in the evening, after he came back from his meeting with Chairman Mao, I did not go on that. Nobody from the State Department did. I was asked to interpret the banquet toast, which was the major policy statement the first day. And I said, sure, no problem. May I see the text? I was told, well, the president's going to do this extemporaneously. I said, I know that's not right. It was Dwight Chapin, who was the appointments secretary, who was conveying this. I said, I really need to see the text. This isn't French or Spanish. So he went in, claimed he saw the president, came out and said, there's no text. And I said, well, Mr. Chapin, that is definitely wrong. You should know that I wrote the draft for tonight's statement. And I have been told that some of Chairman Mao's poetry has been inserted into it. And if you think I'm going to get up in front of the entire world and ad-lib Chairman Mao's poetry from an unknown English translation back into Chinese, you're out of your, and I used a foul word, mind. So at that point he took the text out of his pocket and gave it to the Chinese, who then came to me and said, what is this poetry? And so I helped him identify it.
He had it with him in his jacket pocket.
Yeah, no. So in Hangzhou, President Nixon asked me to come around to apologize. And he did so with tears in his eyes. I shouldn't have done that. I think the reason he did it was he didn't know me. He assumed I would be up there with a text. So he's memorized the speech. He wants to appear to be delivering it extemporaneously, and I spoil it. But I have a memory that's quite as good as his was, and I wouldn't have needed a text. Anyway, so he apologized, and at the end of it, he asked me if I would interpret something for him, some remarks by him to Zhou Enlai, and he said, I want you to take note of this young man. I interpreted that. He said, because he may be our first ambassador to China. And I thought to myself, I was 27, 28. He's saying you're going to have to wait 40 years till this guy grows up before you get an ambassador from the United States, or he's saying, I will send the world's least experienced and incompetent guy I can find off to be my ambassador. And I said, Mr. President, I'm embarrassed. Let the Chinese interpret that, please. So they did, and Zhou Enlai sort of harumphed. And here he was in the middle of Beijing with all sorts of security problems on both sides, apprehensions. And so at Chinese etiquette, you don't drink without toasting someone. So, and then you try to match each other. And so I drank, I'm not a bad drinker, and these guys both got drunk as hell. And the vice foreign minister, Chiao Guanhua, who had a hollow leg if there ever was one, then said to me, you got those guys drunk, try me. I walked out of that banquet having had 23, 24 glasses of Mao Tai, the top of my head falling off, and I'm surprised I survived.
I'm surprised too, and made it back to wherever you were going at the time.
I did,
and you're here with us now, which is
more or less, yes.
Most of you.
Yeah, I think the trip was, it was a huge success on every level.